The story of how Tibetans started writing is a very interesting one. It's actually true that the first Tibetan texts that we have access to are part of a series of extremely influential verse treatises defining a system of writing and grammar for the language. In this video, I'm going to talk about the background leading up to these writings and then look at what these texts say. Indeed, they say a lot about classical Tibetan conceptions of grammar and how they were influenced by Indic ideas. In later videos, I plan on expanding upon this base and talking about some later texts and the ever-changing strategies through which religious texts were translated from Sanskrit. But without further ado, I'll start with some historical background. As you likely are aware, Tibet today is seen as a very pious and peaceful country, and those who would disagree likely aren't hung up on the pious and peaceful bit, and is very closely associated with Buddhism in the eyes of foreigners, but it wasn't always this way. In fact, prior to the introduction of Buddhism to Tibet, it was actually a military power of the Central Asian region that stood in contrast to many of its Buddhist neighbors. Tibet's ancient long-standing dynasty was the Yarlung dynasty. It's hard to say when exactly this dynasty started, because early Tibetan history is often as much mythology as fact, but by the early 6th century, the Yarlung kings had brought most Tibetan tribes under control around Lhasa and the Yarlung Valley, and started to expand outwards. And as they expanded outwards, countries all around them had already taken up Buddhism and other complex religions. Buddhism lay established in the Gangetic Valley since the BC days, with major monasteries in northern India and Nepal, and then it had spread north in Kashmir and Gilgit, and through trade routes it spread to the China-controlled territory to the north and took hold around the Taklamakan Desert. The conquering Tibetan warriors were known as the Red Faces, as they would paint their faces red, and they were known to destroy Buddhist institutions where they passed through, in contrast with their current reputation. In 630, they conquered Zhongjung and became the Tibetan Empire. In the early 7th century, they started official international contact with China. They also sent expeditions to India and would come to dominate the southern ends of the Himalayas and Nepal. Later in the 7th century, they waged war against China itself, taking in even more territory throughout the century, and eventually even collected a yearly tribute from the Chinese emperor for peace. In 763, this was not paid, and in response, the Tibetans sacked its capital and set up a puppet emperor. In summary, the Tibetan Empire was a military power of the region, but on the subject of culture, things are a little bit different. Now, some of what I've just talked about overlaps with the introduction of Buddhism into Tibet, but in the early days they were seen as brutes. They did not write, and they did not have a complex religion. Tibetan kings were not Buddhist, but rather practiced Bon, the indigenous religion of Tibet. It wasn't really a formal or organized religion as much as some set of animistic practices, nothing like the religions of India, which had bodies of works both massive and ancient in the notoriously complex Sanskrit devoted to their study. Tibetan didn't even have a writing system or recorded grammar to its name. But in the 7th century, a king called Songtsen Gampo came around. He was, like other kings of his time, very concerned with military matters, and was the first king to really start expanding out of the Lhasa and Yarlung Valley area that I talked about just now. The conquest of Zhongjung was either during or just before his reign. He arranged a political marriage with a princess of Nepal, and generally saw peace with those people. That peace was not, however, felt with the Chinese, perhaps because of a political marriage. He conquered many tribes subject to the Chinese. He tried to arrange a political marriage with a Chinese princess, but the Tang emperor rejected the barbaric Tibetans. But then Songtsen sent a military campaign to the province of Songzhou in 635, and the Chinese emperor agreed to send a princess by necessity, as one does. Supposedly, his new Chinese wife was a devout Buddhist and brought a statue with her that now stands as a very important image in the very important Jokhang Temple in Tibet. So anyways, it's clear that the king was very concerned with military matters as he expanded his territory and sought alliances. But more importantly to Tibetan traditional histories, he was also concerned with elevating Tibet's perceivedly lacking culture and established Buddhism as the national religion. For this reason, he is regarded as the first of 3 religious kings of Tibet. Of course, practicing a religion is difficult if there are no native language works in existence. Creating native language works is difficult if one's language doesn't have a writing system. This also poses problems for secular matters of communication, for that matter. But an additional problem that Gampo hoped to solve was that even if they had a writing system, a standard grammar would be necessary for works to be understandable and cohesive. He reportedly sent a group of ministers to India to study those knowledges of writing and grammar such that they could come back and create a grammar for Tibetan. Of the ministers sent to India, Tonmi Sambhota was the only one to return to Tibet with completed treatises, somewhere around 640 AD. With him, he brought an alphabet as well as works creating and formalizing a standard Tibetan grammar. This is a very pivotal moment in Tibetan history, to the point that many Tibetans consider this to be the creation of their language, even to the extent that further linguistic analysis of Tibetan's development before this point or as a member of a larger Sino-Tibetan language family is meaningless. Understandably, there is a lot of myth surrounding Tonmi's life, but the short story is that he studied in India for many years under one or two Indian gurus, learning the Sanskrit knowledge of grammar and many writing systems. In total, he wrote 8 treatises on Tibetan writing and grammar, only 2 of which remain today after some purges around the year 900. We have the first of the series, called The Root Grammar in 30 Verses, and the 6th of the series, called something like Grammar, the Application of Signs. It's a bit hard to give short summaries about what exactly is in these works because Tonmi's idea of Tibetan grammar is very much intertwined with writing. While you might hear that the first treatise is concerned with defining a writing system, it in large part deals with some concepts that we in the West would call grammar. I'll get to what I mean by that in a little bit. But anyways, the goal of this set of 8 treatises was to define a writing system and grammar for the Tibetan language to pave the way for the translation of Buddhist texts. I think that the first thing to note about these things, goal aside, is that they were written completely in the new Tibetan language that he had created. It's wonderfully self-referential that the first written texts that we have in Tibetan are texts describing the language itself, and interestingly, at the end of the first treatise, Tonmi states that that very work should be held as an example of what proper written Tibetan looks like. It's such a wonderful comment to make because it recognizes the fact that essentially he is writing a grammar for a group of literary texts of which the only current member is that very text. Thus, in a very canonical way, he is writing in the most perfect Tibetan possible, by definition. Anyways, with these texts finally square in this video's viewfinder, we can actually get into some grammar talking about their contents. As a side note, my references for this video will be in the description as usual, but I'm going to give a special note to Tony Duff's 2 books that are more or less entirely about these texts and the context behind them. I'd already started work on this video, but my own confusion while reading Tonmi's texts led me to get these books, and they have more info on these texts than you could ever want. It's wonderful, and in particular they talk a lot about how Tonmi took directly from Sanskrit traditions in these works, and a lot of that stuff has ended up in this video script. If you're really curious about this topic, I definitely recommend trying to get your hands on them. So his first treatise, meant to develop the basis of his language, is literally called something like The Root Grammar in 30 Verses, where a verse is 4 lines of 7 syllables each. If that sounds like not that much, you're certainly correct. In India, where books were not so readily made and copied as they are now, there is a big culture of writing works on any subject, not just poetry, but things like math, history, medicine, religion, and yes, grammar, in concise verse that was sometimes accompanied by lengthy commentaries in prose. That way, the verse could be easily memorized and recited. One could recite the verse to transfer information orally rather than through the way of the pen, and also one could recite the verse to reflect on the many meanings that were expanded upon in prose commentaries. Thonmi kept with this Indic trend and wrote his 8 treatises completely in terse verse. So indeed, these 2 surviving treatises are quite short, and also pretty easy to find for the Tibetan enthusiasts among you, though I'm sure I wouldn't have to tell said enthusiast that brevity is often inversely related to understandability in the realm of Asian classics. Now, in addition to having complicated grammar, Sanskrit literature also had some complicated verse rules, similar to the iambic pentameter of the also Indo-European English language. Lines should rhyme, each line must have the same number of syllables, and there are also rules concerning alternating stressed syllables. Thonmi paid mind only to the fixed syllable count in a line rule in these texts, which is quite reasonable as Tibetan is more monosyllabic than Sanskrit, so alternating stress doesn't really work, and clauses tend to end with a small set of verb forms and final particles, which makes rhyming a little bit silly. To this day, Tibetan verse has really only paid mind to syllable count in terms of phonological structure. In other ways, too, this text was written in the style of Sanskrit compositions. For example, we can look at how it starts. First he gives the title in Sanskrit, then in Tibetan, starting a tradition which many later Tibetan texts and translations followed, and which, in later revisions of the literary language, would be made necessary. He then pays homage to the Lord of Speech. Paying homage to this particular deity eventually became the standard of so-called Abhidharma texts that served to explain Buddhist Dharma rather than giving first-hand words. Tonmi's grammar was indeed seen as a text that served to explain or expand upon the Buddhist Dharma, as it explained the language used to convey that Dharma. He then pays homage to the three jewels, more deities, and to the Indian teachers that taught him Sanskrit grammar. He then goes on to a sort of statement of purpose, claiming that putting written letters together is central to expression, and so his current work will be concerned with the writing system. These first four elements, the title in Sanskrit and Tibetan, then homages, then a declaration of the reasons and content for the given composition, became standard in Tibetan texts and were borrowed from Indic tradition, excepting, of course, giving the title in Tibetan. So on to the meat of the text. He first says that the alphabet contains vowels and consonants. He actually does this using Sanskrit terms Ali and Kali, which is kind of interesting because for the most part Tonmi, and most translators following him, tends to make up native words for new concepts rather than use transliterated Sanskrit. He claims that there are 10 suffix characters and 5 prefixes, and 20 characters can do neither, and goes on to define which ones can be prefixes and suffixes. I'll remind you that this is all in verse, and he's not naming most of the consonants in question, rather is referring to some completed chart. The literal translation of this section, without messing around with putting it into verse, is something like, the Kali divided into 8 sections of 4, one of which is half that, the bottom 2 of the first, third, and fourth row, as well as the third of the sixth, and the 7th row, excluding Sha, are the 10 suffix letters, and of those suffix letters, the first, third, fifth, sixth, and 7th ones can also be prefixes. I think this is such a silly way of approaching the task of listing the appropriate prefixes and suffixes because this basic task was so clearly and heavily impeded by the necessity of writing this in verse, and that makes me happy. So now is where we get into the grammar of the thing. What we've been talking about so far would all certainly fall under the definition of grammar by Tibetan or Indic standards, but we here in the West would probably just say that it's letter nonsense, phonetics at best. But here they're all tied up. Instead of going on to write about pronunciation or something here, that continuation seems most natural to me, Tonmi kind of slides straight into what is essentially a description of the language's particles. I'm using the word case liberally, but Tibetan sort of has case particles in the same way that a language like Japanese does. So genitive expressions and agent expressions and semantic questions like subject, object, indirect object are all expressed using particles attached to the end of a word, but there are other particles like a concluding statement particle o and semi-concluding particle te that sort of make things into statements. I think it's really interesting that he just immediately goes into this, implying that case rules and company are the second most important thing that you should know after you can spell dog, and also that they are properties of the writing rather than some separate concept of grammar like we tend to think, or more accurately, that writing and grammar are just very intertwined. I think it's wild, and I'll expand on this in a bit, but first it pays to talk about the general system of Tibetan grammar that he outlines throughout his texts that has come to dominate native Tibetan grammar studies. It goes on to a bit of a tangent outside of what he actually wrote in this text, but I think it's worth it. So when he introduces these particles, he doesn't really give a definition of particle. There's no mention equivalent to the English word particle in this book, or even in the Tibetan language as a whole. All he says is that one of the 10 suffix letters with the 4th O vowel marking attached to it after a name will be known as a stopper or concluder. The word he uses sort of means to withdraw again, presumably from the act of speaking, which sort of fits the concluding particle's normal usage. He doesn't expand on this and just moves on to the next particle, so we sort of have two questions. What does a concluder do, and what is a name? The first question, as I said, should be pretty easy for a Tibetan to answer because they speak the language and recognize that he is talking about a sort of sentence final particle that forms statements. And of course in native commentaries on this treatise it is explained in more detail. But the second question is a bit less trivial, and is related to how he characterizes what we'd call the grammar of the language. Now in this first text, Thonmi doesn't develop this theory, but he does later, and as I said, I think it's worth it to go over now. The basic idea is that Tibetan letters make up names, and a name is just like a simple word with a primitive meaning, like cat or dog or give. But a name can combine with some more letters, often grammary letters, what we in English might call participles or conjunctions or what have you, but which don't have a unified name in Tibetan, to make phrases. A phrase can be something like of the dog, or by the cat, or it is the man, or men. These are phrases because those extra letters that those base names combine with could not stand on their own. So in English terms, Tonmi wouldn't consider a word like of to be a name or word or anything, just a set of letters that can be combined with a name to make a phrase. So a name is a fundamental root with some concrete meaning, and a phrase is a name combined with some fundamental root without its own concrete meaning. But a name isn't always just a word. Sometimes a name may not really be able to function on its own. For example, adjectives typically need suffixes to function in a sentence. So a name like car has some primitive meaning of whiteness, but to function as an adjective white, you need to add some letters at the end to get a phrase, white. This can happen with nouns too. The name Kong is associated with some abstract meaning of house, but you can't really use it as such in a sentence unless you add pa to make it a phrase meaning house. Verbs are often another example of this. Ton has a primitive meaning of show, but adding the letter pa at the end gives a phrase, showing, that functions as a verbal noun. Now these distinct grammatical ideas of a name and phrase don't really translate super well into English, because although Tibetan grammar textbooks are very concerned with keeping these two ideas separate, we can see, for example, that the name person and the phrase house and the phrase showing are all just nouns. It's hard to associate phrases and names with their own unique grammatical behavior as we do in English. Phrases can get more grammary and complicated like of the man, but not by necessity. Now there's also a concept in Tibetan of name equivalence and phrase equivalence. Name equivalent is just something that acts like a name, even if it is more than just one syllable morpheme whatever. For example, the word glasses would be a name equivalent in Tibetan because it is a compound of two separate names, eye and glass, that kind of functions as if it were one name meaning eyeglasses. A phrase equivalent has a similar definition. And then a combination of two or more words or two or more phrases or some combination thereof is known as an expression. This idea is similarly difficult to translate into English. An expression may be a complete thought or a group of thoughts, or may not be a complete thought at all. It could correspond to a group of English sentences, or it could be something like the foot's toe. There's not really any native concept that fully fits the idea of an English sentence. You can talk about a complete expression, but those are usually much longer than our sentences and contain several sort of clauses in them. The idea that names, phrases, and expressions don't really seem to have internally consistent grammatical properties, like how we've seen that all of them can correspond to an English noun, makes the system seem strange to me, but oh well. So to summarize, letters form names, which are sort of like our morphemes, or at least those with concrete meanings like dog or give. Names combined with extra grammar meaning-y letters can form phrases, and names and phrases combine to form expressions. I'll contrast this with how Westerners think of English grammar as an example. In English grammar, we essentially wouldn't have distinct ideas between names and phrases. Rather, we just have a single concept of a word. So letters, or more accurately morphemes, combine to form words, and words combine to form expressions or sentences. So this Tibetan idea of grammar differs from our variant by considering these particles, these non-name letters, as something different from a word. They aren't separate words, but they also aren't in the same basic name unit as their host word, and thus we have a distinction between names and phrases. In English, we don't stand by this distinction. For example, we would just consider something like of to be a word, even if it doesn't make much sense on its own. By Tonmi's grammatical ideas, the Tibetan equivalent to of isn't really a thing on its own. He doesn't want to call it a name because it has no concrete meaning, thus he sees fit to create some grammatical idea of a phrase which is separate from a name. So his analysis would consider something like of only with the context of some word it is attached to. Of is not a word, but of dog is a phrase. So while in English we look at sentences as combinations of words or morphemes, Tonmi's Tibetan model looks at expressions as combinations of two basic things, names and phrases. Hopefully that wasn't too long, but now we can understand his specific language when he is defining these particles. So when he says that a suffix letter carrying the fourth vowel placed after a name will be known as a conclusion, we now understand this a lot better. He is not really explaining this as a particle. What he is literally saying is that if you put a suffix letter carrying the fourth vowel o after a name, then those suffix letters will be concluding, and thus the resulting phrase is concluding. And I think it's lovely that he introduces this concluding suffix not as some special suffix, but as a sort of property of the letters themselves. The English way to phrase this would be something like how I introduced this suffix, saying, hey, there exists a concluding particle, it has a conclusive meaning, and it takes the form of the last letter of the word it attaches to, followed by the vowel o. I introduced the particle as something separate from the letters and sounds. The letters were a means to express the sound of the particle, which is a property of the particle itself. There's sort of a hierarchy where grammar is this top-level idea of how meaning is organized, and sound is just how grammar manifests itself, and letters are just how we try to represent that sound. But again, Tonmi sort of sees letters and grammar as the same thing, and you can really see this in his wording. He essentially says that a suffix letter placed in this specific way is a conclusion, that they are the same thing, the letters and this grammatical idea, and of course he continues to use this same language when talking about the other particles. So in Tonmi's mind, letters and sounds and grammar are all sort of on the same level because of how he organizes his writings and because he defines these particles specifically as properties of letters, and thus letters are in some way a grammatical unit. We also see this outlook in his decision to go over the particle suffixes in his first treatise on writing, even before he talks about phonology. When I was first reading this, I was surprised that he went straight from defining the letters to talking about particles, but to Tonmi, these aren't written forms of some special particles, but rather are really just special uses of letters. So of course you'd want to talk about these right when you first talk about letters. I think it's really interesting how his understanding of writing and grammar are so intertwined. And again, we can say that this is a sign of Sanskrit influence. I won't go too far into it, but the Indic theory from which Tonmi learned also displayed this convergence of grammar and letters, or grammar and sounds. There's a concept in Indic tradition of the 5 knowledges, or 5 sciences. One of these is the knowledge of sound. This knowledge of sound is divided into the study of unarticulated sound, that is, non-speech things like the wind blowing or fire crackling, and articulated sound. The knowledge of articulated sound includes all sorts of knowledges about human speech, from the actual science behind how we physically articulate things in our mouths to grammar stuff, how we organize our information through speech. They saw the study of languages as a study of the sounds that make up those languages. So it's pretty easy to see that Tonmi had a Sanskrit precedent in organizing his text in this specific way. So anyways, after he defines the final particle, he goes on and lists a bunch of other particles. Like with the concluding particle, he doesn't really stop and say what they mean, just their name and of what combinations of letters they are formed. And often even in that he can be downright cryptic. He starts with a few Tibetan sort of oblique particles that he calls law terms. I won't go into these too much, but it's interesting that he introduces them all as law terms, even though they are distinct case particles that can have distinct meanings, probably because Sanskrit doesn't have so many oblique distinctions. Even if you look at a modern Tibetan textbook, you'll probably be a little bit confused when they talk about these particles because a lot of them tend to treat them as sort of the same but somehow different, and I think that trend probably starts here. He then talks about the genitive and agentive case particles. These particles sort of harmonize their beginning consonant with the form they are attached to, so he has to explain this in verse as well. Then he goes on to name what he calls phrase ornaments that kind of link phrases, and goes on to define the continuative particle te, which is sort of like the final particle, but it marks that more sentences to come. It's less final. And I think I have to say, the more I read, the more inconvenient this verse gets. So the form of the continuative is ste, and the way that he decides to tell us what it is just the worst. He says to take the oblique su, erase the vowel, then add the first letter from the third row, then add the third vowel marker to that, and that's called the continuative. It's so silly, there's no reason for him to start from that su law term aside from just verse shenanigans, and it took me so long to realize what he was even talking about. It's like he's trying to make this hard to read. Anyways, he then talks about some more particles. I'll spare you the details. Again, I'm throwing the word particle around for my own convenience, but he doesn't use any equivalent word, just introduces all of these ideas separately. There are a lot of these sorts of particles in Tibetan, as one might expect, and he doesn't name all of them in his text. There are just too many, and I expect that the task of listing and categorizing them would have been too much anyways. This left some room for more grammarians to step in and write treatises categorizing some more such letter groups that Mr. Minister missed. Sometimes they expand the categories that he defines here, and sometimes not. I won't get into that. So after he's done listing particles for our 21st century pleasure, we see him step back, wrapping things up and giving us some advice. He says that these word connections that he has listed in his text were also used in this text, and thus that this text should be used as a model for how they should be used. Again, he is writing in perfect Tibetan by definition. Words must be connected through these particles, and if we understand them, then reading and writing will not be a hindrance to us, but rather the meaning of scripture will come to us with the instruction of our teachers. Thanks for the encouragement. He tells us to study hard, learn our prefixes, radicals, and suffixes, find a worthy teacher to study from, and our understanding will be opened. And that's all there really is to this first text. As I said, he wrote 8 treatises in full, and only 2 of them have survived to the modern day, so there is one more treatise to look at. I'm going to end this video here, though, and talk about that some other time. But I'll summarize some of the main takeaways from this first treatise here. Tonmi styled his writings in Indic tradition in the way that he introduced his writing and in his concise, versy style, and he even references Sanskrit concepts directly when he introduces vowels and consonants. Later Tibetan writers and translators would continue to be heavily influenced by Sanskrit tradition. Perhaps most striking, his thoughts on grammar were also influenced by Sanskrit norms. In this first text, as well as in his other writings, he seems to think of letters and sounds as something that is very intertwined with and on the same level as grammar, and this shows in how he organizes his treatises and in the specific language that he uses, as he introduces these particles as properties of the letters even before he goes into phonetics, implying that these meanings are at least as tied up with the letters that denote them as the pronunciation of those letters. It's an interesting thing to think about. But of course, the history of the written Tibetan language is much greater than the sum of Tonmi's original writings, influential though they may have been. There is a long and interesting history of translation in particular that was started from these works with a lot of changing methods and ideas to look at. Hopefully someday I can scratch the surface.